Welcome to the first episode of the new series of the Civil Disagreement podcast from Radix, the think tank for the Radical Centre, and it's now available on the Real Agenda network of podcasts for progressive change. Now, as today's show is a recording of a live event, this has had some impact on the audio quality. So I'm going to hand over now to Nick Silver from Radix.
Hello, I'm Nick Silver, a founder and director of Radix, the think tank of the Radical Centre. This is the first in our series of Civil Disagreement podcasts. It's a recording of a live event from earlier this year in which we debate whether Britain will need to increase taxes to pay for COVID debt. To discuss this, we have Randy Wray, one of the main proponents of modern monetary theory, which is a controversial but increasingly influential school of economic thought, and Paul de Grauw, a leading but much more mainstream economist. We actually end up with a civil agreement that we don't need to increase taxes, at least for the time being. But to get there, we do have a disagreement, a civil one, about how the economy actually works. This podcast is intellectually challenging, but I do hope you will enjoy it.
Will we really need to increase taxes to pay off COVID debts? And we're delighted to have joining us from America, Professor Randall Wray, who's the leading exponent of modern monetary theory, MMT, which is now an increasingly influential economics school of thought, which hopefully provide a certain framework for thinking about that question. And in response, we've got another leading economist, Paul de Grauw. And we were due to have Patience Wheatcroft chairing this session, but unfortunately her internet's down, although she is here. So she'll start off with some introductory remarks, but so you'll start with me, I'm afraid, but fortunately we've got the very accomplished Magda Poland, former IMF, Goldman Sachs, now works at Elgin and is a Radix board member, to chair. And the way we intend to do it is we'll have some starting remarks from the two speakers, followed by panel discussion, and then during the discussion, please feel free to submit questions, and either we'll bring you into it directly or we'll ask your question. So just to start off, would Patience like to start off with some introductory remarks? Patience, you're on the phone.
Well, thank you very much. I'm talking down a landline, which is not something I've done very much of in a long time, but I'm delighted to be able to take part at all. I'm fascinated by tonight's subject because it's increasingly being talked about, and yet it's actually at odds with everything that I was ever taught about economics. Probably like many of you, I was of the belief that if governments went on printing money, they would have to pay for it, and it would be very painful in the end. And examples such as Zimbabwe and Venezuela were always cited, that rip-roaring inflation would hit and everything would go to pot very quickly. At the moment, that really doesn't seem to be the case. We had QE on a massive scale in the wake of the financial crisis, and we still haven't seen the unwinding of that. But neither have we had the inflation that might have come. And now we're faced with huge bills for COVID, a government which is just throwing money at the problem. And I don't know about you, but I can't see how else it could at the moment address the issue. But I had certainly been at the school of thought, and indeed have been on a Radix seminar before now, when we've discussed quite how and through which tax rises government would start paying for the spending spree. But now comes this wonderful idea that the magic money tree really might exist, and that its fruit will be highly edible and not poisonous, as we've always been brought up to believe. So I'm fascinated to hear how that could be the case. And the more I've looked at new monetary theory, I'm still skeptical, but nevertheless, there are some ideas that are being talked about under its orbit, which do have appeal to me, because we are now used to the furlough scheme and government paying people not to work. But I'm really quite enamored of the scheme that says once it's printing money on a grand scale, government can use it to pay people to work. And that has a great deal of appeal. So yes, let's invest in infrastructure. Let's certainly improve the quality of broadband, please. And let's use public money to pay people to provide those services. So that's a very, very brief and broad look at what I'm getting out of new monetary theory. I'm still not convinced, but I'm very much interested to hear what both our very, very high-powered speakers tonight are going to have to say about it. So thank you for listening. I hope you have been. I can't tell. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Patience, for your remarks. So can I hand over to Magda? So Magda, would you like to kick off the sharing the thing?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. I'm very glad that we are starting this series of seminars for this year with economics, my favorite topic, and of course with the topic that has been into so many people's minds. One of the key words of last year, probably could be one of the words of the year, together with You're on Mute, is unprecedented. Unprecedented increase in debt, unprecedented crash in economic activity, unprecedented engagement of the government. And unprecedented situations call for potentially new unprecedented solutions. And one of those, and the events, brought back attention to the modern monetary theory and MMT. And Randy Wray here is one of the parents of the theory and the thinking behind it. Randy, what do you think? Is the event indeed unprecedented? And what can MMT offer as a new unprecedented theory in this situation?
Right. So thanks for the introductions. Instead of going directly into the questions, I wanted to give some background on MMT because it's been in the press a lot, but whenever I read summaries of MMT, it has nothing to do with what we talk about. And so I think it's important to start off with our understanding of the way that sovereign currencies operate, how fiscal and monetary policy works in countries that have their own sovereign currencies. So first, let me list the requirements that identify a sovereign currency. It is one in which the national government chooses the money of account, imposes obligations such as taxes, fees, fines, tribute, tithes in the money of account. It issues a currency that it accepts in payment of those obligations. And if it issues other obligations such as bonds, these are also payable in the nation's own currency. And so we argue that it follows that a country that meets those conditions really doesn't face a budget constraint as normally defined and as we would apply to households or firms. Second, it cannot run out of its own money. Third, it can meet all of its obligations by paying in its own currency. And fourth, it can set the interest rate on any obligation that it issues. Before coronavirus, our critics claimed we were calling on the Fed to drop helicopter money that would, and this has already been mentioned, cause Zimbabwe levels of hyperinflation. MMT was dismissed as crazy talk. By March, everyone was arguing that central banks should fly helicopters around and drop money into the economy. So we find that kind of hilarious. But we actually never called on central banks to just print money to pay for fiscal stimulus. We never supported quantitative easing 10 years ago when that was adopted by central banks. So while we're glad MMT is in the news, what we actually say is that the procedures that have been adopted over the past century involving treasuries, central banks, and private banks are already capable of providing the fiscal stimulus that we needed after the global financial crisis and today after the global pandemic. No change of procedures is required. We don't have to invent some new way to pay for things. No money printing is needed. No helicopter drops of money is required. All we have to do is pass the budget and authorize the spending. Central banks and the Treasury already know how to spend. What we emphasize is that sovereign governments face resource constraints, not financial constraints. Too much spending, whether it's by the government or by the private sector, can cause inflation. It might even affect exchange rates, but we're not going to run out of money to finance spending. Now, before we documented how sovereign government really spends, I don't think any academic economist really understood how this was done. Now, clearly the people who work in operations knew, but academic economists did not. In the old days, government just notched tally sticks, they minted coins, or they printed up paper money before they spent. Then they collected them in what were called redemption taxes, and they burned or melted down all the revenue. Revenue means return to. The government's currency is returned so that it can be burned. Today, all modern governments use central banks to make and receive all payments for the Treasury, and they do that through the private banks. That adds two confusing degrees of separation between government and its citizens, making it seem that governments have to tax first and then spend. But in reality, sovereign governments must spend first and then tax. Government spending takes the form of a credit by the central bank to a private bank's reserves, and a credit by that private bank to the recipient's bank deposit. All tax payments just reverse that, with a debit to the bank's reserves and a debit to the taxpayer's account. Those debits are the modern equivalent of burning the revenue. You can't burn revenue you did not spend or lend first. Central banks and treasuries cooperate to ensure this works smoothly. Modern procedures also involve bond sales, whether or not the budget ends up in a surplus, balanced, or deficit at the end of the year. And through dealer banks, those are issued and the dealer banks must place bids on the debt. The system works. Treasury checks never bounce. Good budgeting is consistent with national priorities as expressed by the will of the elected representatives. The US Congress mandates that policy should be directed to achieve high employment, moderate inflation, and reasonable economic growth. There's a growing consensus that policy ought to promote greater equality, and many are now pushing for policy to tackle climate change as well as this first global pandemic, and more are sure to come. These are worthy goals too. MMT is not alone in recognizing that austere fiscal policy over the past few decades has led to substandard growth, higher unemployment, and rising inequality. So what does MMT add to the discussion about budgeting? Budgeting should be functional rather than constrained by some preconceived idea of a proper ratio between spending and taxing, or of prudent deficits and debt ratios. What matters is resource availability, not finance. If resources are available and government can use them in the public interest, government ought to put them to use. What about deficits and debt? Does an ability to borrow limit the government's access to finance? No. A sovereign government never needs to borrow its own currency. Bond sales by a sovereign government are not really a borrowing operation. Rather, they are to offer a higher interest earning substitute for bank reserves. Governments can make all payments as they come due. Bond vigilantes cannot force default of a sovereign government. While their portfolio preferences could affect its interest rates and exchange rates, the central bank's interest rate target is the most important determinant of the entire structure of bond rates. In truth, the only bond vigilante we face is the central bank. And in recent years, the major central banks have promised to keep rates low far into the future. Finally, Even if the central bank abandons low rates, the Treasury can afford to make all payments on debt as they come due, no matter how high the central bank sets rates. Affordability is not the problem. The issue is the desirability of making big interest payments to bondholders. In extraordinary times, such as the era of the global pandemic and climate catastrophe, government may need to move more resources from private use to public use. Since finance is not an issue for government, it can always win a bidding war, but at the cost of setting off inflation. MMT helps to shift the debate away from can we afford it to a discussion of resource mobilization to save the planet while developing a truly universal healthcare system that that serves everyone in the era of pandemics. So ask not how to pay for it, rather, what is the inflation potential of policy? We already have the procedures in place to pay for the resources needed. All we need is to find idle resources, create new ones, or shift employed resources to meet these new goals. So with that, I'll stop with the introduction to MMT.
Thank you, Randy. If I may just remind everybody to please switch off your video feed and go on mute so that we preserve the bandwidth and we make sure that the speakers are visible. Paul, you come from a more traditional school of economics, although you have been known as an innovator in your field and many other fields of economics. How do you look at the main tenets of MMT? And second, how do you think we can tackle the key question of tonight's discussion? How are we going to pay for the COVID debts?
Thank you, Magda. I'm very pleased to be here to participate in this discussion. I'm going to deal with this question that I was asked, which is how to deal with this increase, the surge in debt produced by COVID crisis, and do we have to pay for all this by increasing taxes? And I will come essentially to the same answer as Randall, without actually having to refer to the new monetary theory. In other words, using traditional tools of analysis, right? I would like to share screen though. Can I do that?
Yes, I think so. We just need to consult with Ben.
Can you allow me to do that?
Just a second. Ben is our host, so he will do that. Could you try to do that now?
You should be able to do that now, yeah.
I should be able to do it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the question that we were asked to answer, right? Will we really need to increase taxes to pay off COVID debts? By way of introduction, let me just show you this little graph here, which is an historical comparison of the recession that we have known now with COVID and compared to two previous important recessions, the one of 2008, 2009, and then the Great Depression of the 1930s, right? So the red line, so the way it's done here, it starts with the start of the crisis. So in the Great Depression, this was June 29. In April, in the Great Recession of 2008, it starts in April 2008, and then now we have the start in February 2020. This is in just the world industrial production. And on the horizontal axis, you have months since the start of the crisis. And what strikes here is the following. First of all, the intensity of the decline during the pandemic now is unprecedented, right? Compared to what happened in these previous two great depressions. But also the extremely quick recovery, right? Or at least up to now, we never know what's going to happen. And the main reason is that these two previous crises were banking crises. And once the crisis was set in motion, it was very difficult to recover because banks were impaired. They didn't want to provide credit any longer. And as a result, the recovery was extremely protracted. So we have this big difference here that we find. So it also leads to some optimism about potential for recovery. It looks like if the different programs of vaccination are successful, we may actually get out of this mess very quickly compared to what we have seen in the past, right? So now, what have the policy reactions been? Very much like in the previous recession of 2008, massive intervention of the authorities, fiscal authorities, trying to prevent a deflationary spiral. And this has led to large increase in budget deficits and government debt levels, in fact, larger than what happened in 2008. Here I show you the size of the budget deficits that occurred during the pandemic last year, right? Unprecedented increases in budget deficits. Role of central banks were also key. They provided massive amounts of liquidity in the system. And this was key also to prevent a deflationary spiral that was set in motion by this crisis, right? Which is very well known in economics. When you get this negative demand and supply shock, and people scramble for liquidity, there is always a danger that this scramble for liquidity will lead to further asset sales and further deflationary downward spirals. And this was prevented mainly by central banks. Here I show you the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve and European Central Bank, and you can see the massive increase in the balance sheet of these two institutions during the last year, historically actually bigger than what happened during the banking crisis of 2008, 2009. So the authorities understood the nature of the problem. Both the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities massively intervened. And here I show you that now, today, large amounts of government bonds are actually held by the central bank, have been monetized, right? So we can see that there has been a realization by both fiscal authorities and monetary authorities that the system had to be supported. The market system was in danger of actually collapsing. An implosion was very much possible. And this was prevented. So we learned, right, from history, right? The big mistakes of the 1930s have been avoided. And I think we learned from all that, and we avoided these massive downward spirals. Is there a need for austerity to deal with the surge in government debt? So the result of this crisis has been a massive increase in government debt. And then my answer will be no, there is no need for austerity to deal with this surge in government debt. And this has much to do with the fact that we are now in a regime when the nominal interest rate on the debt is lower than the nominal growth rate of the economy, right? And this has as an implication a favorable debt dynamics, which has the effect of leading to an automatic decline of the government debt to GDP ratio without the need for austerity. So in other words, without higher taxes and or lower spending. And this contrasts with periods that we have known previously, where the opposite occurred, where the nominal interest rate on the government debt exceeded the nominal growth in the economy. So note, when I say nominal growth, I mean the real growth plus inflation, right? And when we faced this regime, then of course the underlying dynamics of government debt was was an unstable one, an explosive one. It was in fact a Ponzi game where governments were issuing debt, and they paid the interest by issuing new debts. But since the nominal interest rate exceeded the nominal growth rate, the effect was that the debt to GDP ratio was on an explosive path, necessitating either austerity or, if you don't want to do that, inflation, right? And this is the story that we have known in the past. But now we face a different regime that has much to do with the fact that the long-run real interest rates have tended to decline as a result of massive saving surpluses in the world, and as a result a turnaround in the regime, and allowing fiscal policy, in fact, to do its job of stimulating the economy without having to be worried about financial constraints. So today, I join Randall here, that today there is no worry about financial constraints. The question is whether this can be generalized to all periods, and there I would disagree. I think there have been, and there will be, or there could be in the future, situations where we get into a different regime about interest rates and growth rates, which then brings back the sovereign, the debt constraint for governments. Here I did some very simple simulation using the so-called DOMA model. That is a very old model, right? 50 years old, which shows the favorable situation we are here. So I look at the 30-year bond yields today in a number of countries: Germany, France, UK, Spain, and Italy. And then I ask the question: what would happen with the debt to GDP, with the debt that we create today as a result of COVID, right? And assuming that this is financed by the issue of 30-year bond yield, by 30-year bonds. And then I apply this DOMA formula, which you see there, which is DT is a debt to GDP ratio, and DT minus 1 is a debt to GDP ratio in the previous period, and then 1 plus R being the nominal interest rate and G the nominal growth rate. And if the nominal interest rate is lower than a nominal growth rate, then you can see that this coefficient in front of dt minus 1 is smaller than 1, and this leads to a stabilizing, a stable development, right, where the debt to GDP ratio has a tendency to decline without you having to do any austerity. So you can see there the PB, which is the primary budget. It can be set equal to 0, and that's what I do here. So in other words, without doing austerity, you can see that the debt that we create today, financed at today's conditions in a 30-year horizon, the debt to GDP ratio will tend to decline for most of these countries, right? For all these countries that I have here. And I assume here a nominal growth of GDP of 3%. You can assume 1 of 2%, which would be a very low nominal growth rate historically. And you get a similar picture that we can, so to say, we can lay back, right, in our easy chair, and after having increased the debt today to finance the crisis management, this debt to GDP ratio will tend to decline automatically. So we have the capacity now to lock in this new favorable regime for the next 10 or even longer. And so therefore there is no need at all for austerity searching that. And I come to the same conclusion without having had to refer to the new monetary theory at all. Now, I was planning to say a few things about the Eurozone, but I think that the time is limited, but just also introduce this idea that Randall has stressed, that is that we have to make a distinction between governments that are sovereign, that is, that are issuing their own money, and governments that are not, like, for example, the members of the Eurozone that are not sovereign in that sense because they issue debt in a currency which is not their own, they have no control over, and these creates a very different situation for these governments, right, that I have analyzed also for many years now. This can lead to self-fulfilling crisis, where the market, fearing liquidity problems of these governments that are not backed by a central bank, may actually set in motion a liquidity crisis, pushing or forcing these countries into austerity and even default, right? So, and it's key there that there is a central bank willing to provide liquidity, and the ECB has accepted to do that in 2012. But the problem is that we don't know for sure whether in the future the ECB will continue to be willing to do that. And that creates a very special problem for the Eurozone countries, right? Necessitating to move into a real political union and budgetary union in order to sustain the Eurozone in the long run. But I will not deal further on this, but I guess there, Randall and me are on the same wavelength, right? Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. So what we are getting is really that, and also I can follow from the questions on the chat, is that maintaining growth will be one of the key aspects of repaying COVID debts, regardless of the approach we are taking, whether it is a much more traditional Keynesian policies of sustaining growth and benefiting from low interest rates, or whether we are going for a bit more flexible rules. One thing that, rather two things that I think you both touched upon, and there's a lot of questions on the chat. Money creation. What I think modern monetary theory stipulates is that we should shift the functions of the central bank and the government and change the process of fractional banking and reserve money creation from the central bank to the government. Randy, could you maybe talk more about that? Because we seem to have a lot of questions and a lot of concern whether this would actually work or whether this will not be a very inflationary policy.
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. Actually, no. MMT is not arguing we need to switch over the functions and somehow make the central bank responsible for the spending. Not at all. We argue, along with, I think, many fairly orthodox economists, that we have put far too much emphasis on monetary policy and this belief in an omnipotent central bank that could replace fiscal stabilization policy. We've always opposed that. So we want more emphasis on fiscal policy, but we are not advocating any change to the role played by the Treasury and the role played by the central bank in the financing of government spending. It works. That's the point I was making. Central banks control the base interest rate. Whether they should be completely independent in choosing the rate target, maybe is something we could argue about. But the fact is that they do choose that base rate. Markets don't choose that. Savers don't set that. It has nothing to do with the supply and demand for vulnerable funds. It is set by the central bank. And we can have a ZIRP, zero interest rate policy forever if the central bank chooses to do that, or if the elected representatives that control the central bank mandate that. Whether it's a good policy or not, I think is also something we can talk about. The problem with interest payments growing is not an affordability issue. It's a question of inflationary impacts, as Paul was talking about. I agree that when you increase the debt ratio to 100% to 200%, and you have central bank high interest rate policy, the government is going to be making a lot of interest payments. Those potentially could be inflationary. They also tend to exacerbate inequality because the wealth holders tend to be, the government bond holders tend to be institutions or high wealth individuals. And so there's a question about whether the government really ought to be spending a lot on interest that is benefiting a small subset of the population that probably doesn't need that benefit. So it's not an issue of whether we can afford to pay the high interest. It's whether it's a good idea to pay a lot on interest. So let me just say one more thing about the relationship between interest rate and growth. I saw that there also were some chat comments on this. And so Paul is pointing out that in current circumstances, if we start to recover, the growth rate is going to likely be above the base interest rate and the interest rate on government debt. So the debt service payments will remain very low. They're historically low in the United States, even with a high debt ratio, because the interest rate is low. But of those two variables, the interest rate is the one that is perfectly discretionary. We can set that wherever we want. The growth rate is not discretionary. We can try to influence it through good policy. The budget deficit is not discretionary. That depends on the, I would need to go through wind, godly, and sectoral balances, but it depends on the private sector's balance plus the rest of the world balance. The deficit is an ex post outcome. It is not something that is discretionary. So out of all of these variables, there's only one that is perfectly discretionary, and it is the interest rate. And we can set it wherever we want.
Thank you, Randy. So
Can I react to this?
Yes, Paul,
Yeah,
of course,
yeah.
yes, go ahead.
Because I think there was a difference in view about what the central bank can do, right? Randall says the central bank can set the interest rate at any level, right? The long-term interest rate is essentially determined by the real rate, right? Plus, importantly, expectations of inflation, right? And so a central bank, therefore, can only control the nominal interest rate if it manages to maintain and put it at zero, say, or close to the real rate or something, only if it can maintain expectations of inflation equal to zero, right? That's the only condition in which it can do that. And now, if you say it can do all these things and issue money and keep expectations of inflation zero, yeah, then the nominal interest rate is a discretionary variable, but it's not. It will be determined by what kind of money creation is done by the central bank. And in that sense, I don't think you can argue that long-term interest rates on government bonds is something that the central bank can continue to control. In the past, certainly, it has been unable to control. In most of the 20th century, central banks have been unable to do so. Is that because they didn't understand new monetary theory? No, it's because the long-term interest rate is determined by expected inflation, right? And that's actually what imposes a condition on what a central bank can do. I do agree with the fact that in the Keynesian analysis, for example, the shift should be on fiscal policy, right? That's for sure. If you want to move the economy today, it shouldn't be by monetary policy, but it should be by fiscal policy. Investment, long-term investment, for example, public investment are key in the future sustainable recovery. And there I would share what Randall has been saying.
Thank you, Paul. And we have some questions from Kevin Langford here, and also from myself, because Randy almost posed an existential problem for me that bond vigilantes do not exist and they cannot force the government into in trouble, or the market does not determine interest rates. Now, having my quite some experience in the emerging markets and a crisis that troubles some of them, I think that potentially show that the limits of MMT thinking. Paul, do you think that MMT has most applications just for, or maybe it's very much derived from the US situation and the setup of the market in the US? Would you have good lessons from MMT for the Eurozone? and also then for other countries, especially those that do not have that monetary sovereignty and that monetary credibility that has been built up for years by the Federal Reserve.
Well, that's the key insight, right? The new monetary theory emphasizes this, but this was known before. The new monetary theory was becoming popular, right? That countries that are not monetary, do not have monetary sovereignty, have to operate in very different conditions than countries that have full monetary sovereignty, right? That's a key insight, also something that we have learned in the Eurozone, because apparently some people were not fully aware of this when the Eurozone was started, that is that the governments of these member countries of the Eurozone would dramatically change their financial conditions because they were not backed individually by a central bank any longer that were capable of providing the liquidity in times of crisis. And so this was, in a way, forgotten by those who started, but not the academic economists. And so that's a key insight. And also quite a lot of the emerging countries have faced that problem whenever they have issued bonds in foreign currency, right? All these crises that we have seen in Latin American countries were driven mainly, but not exclusively, but mainly by the fact that countries like Argentina were financing their budget deficit by issuing dollar bonds, right? But they had no, this was a foreign currency, and therefore there was no central bank backing up the Argentinian government. And that led to cycles of crisis and bond holders selling massively and sudden debt and all that. So we have known that, but it's not exclusively that. When you look at Carmen Reinhardt and Rogoff's book, This Time is Different, they document that also sovereign countries, right, have experienced a large number of defaults, right? So these were sovereign governments, right? And they document that since 1970, there have been 35 defaults on domestic government bonds, right, by countries. So a huge amount. So it illustrates that yes, there are budget constraints for governments, right? Even those that are backed up by their own central bank. And quite often these countries have had a choice: either we do an outright default or we'll let inflation take over. And quite a lot have decided at a certain moment to actually have an outright default. And some also, quite a lot, have also chosen inflation to do the job of eroding the value of these government bonds. So it's not gone, right? These things will not disappear because we now have new monetary theories. They will come back. It's not because today it seems to be easy to do so, because we are in a deflationary environment, right? That this will be the regime that will hold for the rest of humanity.
I agreed with almost everything Paul said up until the very end on the Reinhardt and Roga book. It does not actually have any examples of those. We have critiqued it at the Levy Institute if anyone's interested in that. Look, no one is foolish enough to bet against a central bank operating in its own currency. The Fed sets the interest rate. And as Paul was saying, within the euro area, the problem is the individual nations gave up their currency. So now it's up to the ECB. But the ECB can set the interest rate within Europe if it's willing to do so. Whatever it takes, as has been said, they can do that if they want to. And only fools bet against central banks. Many fools have bet time and again against the Bank of Japan, and they always lose their money. Okay, so bond vigilantes do not set the interest rates on government bonds. If a central bank announces that we're going to keep the interest rate near zero as far into the future as we can see, the market is going to believe that. and they can keep the rate down. Let me just say one thing, because Paul keeps saying new monetary theory. It is modern money theory. It is a theory of how modern money works. It is not a claim that we have a new theory. Our theory follows John Maynard Keynes. And in fact, the title, Modern Money Theory, came from a comment made by Keynes in the Treatise on Money, when he sort of joked that, well, I mean, we made it a joke, when he said that this theory I'm describing of state money applies for the past 4,000 years at least. So it's a theory that applies to monetary systems for the past 4,000 years at least. Not claiming a new theory. We're reviving a theory that was long lost, even within the Keynesian paradigm. Okay? So I just want to make that clear. We're not claiming we have a new theory.
Thank you, Andy. We have tons of questions on the chat, and I'm going to pick up just a few, so please forgive me if I don't pick yours. But we've had a very interesting question. Also, I have this myself. You said a couple of times that first you argue that governments should not be even issuing bonds, or that the central bank should finance governments. However, there is more to bond market than just the government bonds. We also have corporate debt market, we have bank debt, we have other forms of debt. How would we set interest rates in the environment where we don't have that long-term benchmark from the government? Don't you think this could create quite some market instability by removing that rate from the market?
Okay, first, to clarify again, we're not saying central banks should finance the Treasury. We're saying central banks make all payments for the Treasury. That's a description of reality. It's not a policy proposal. It describes how central banks finance Treasury spending today. Central banks make and receive all payments for the Treasury. This is not a policy proposal. It's a description of the way that it works. Now, we say that bond sales are not necessary. You can leave reserves in the banking system. When the government spends, there will be a credit of reserves to the private banking system. Now, before the global financial crisis in the United States, we didn't pay any interest on reserves. So that meant that banks held a zero earning asset whenever the government spent. Now, since the time of the global financial crisis, we began paying interest on reserves. So now interest on reserves is a good substitute for issuing bonds, okay? But to your question of whether it's a good idea to eliminate longer maturities, okay, because reserves and 30-day bills are just about perfect substitutes. But it's true that a lot of corporations and insurance funds and so on want to hold longer term treasuries as part of their portfolio. It's worth discussing whether that is in the public interest. And if so, I don't see any problem with continuing to issue long-term government bonds to pursue the public interest of having very safe earning assets that can be held by insurance companies and so on. Also by private households that want to have a very safe earning asset. This is something that can be discussed, okay? And it's something that should be addressed by policymakers. Is there enough public interest in that to have the government issue bonds? And if so, maybe we want to issue bonds even when the government is not running a deficit. Go ahead and issue bonds because we see a public interest in doing that. Fine, it's worth discussing. So I'm not necessarily calling for eliminating all government bond sales. I'm just saying we don't need to sell them, but we may decide it's a good policy to sell them.
Thanks, Andy. One of the tenets of MMT is a jobs guarantee. Can you please tell us why is that an important element of the policy set?
Well, one of the arguments against government providing a universal job guarantee at a decent wage with decent living standards and so on is that this is an open-ended promise, and the government spending on this is open-ended. It will be determined by the number of people who show up demanding a job. Well, if government finance is severely constrained, this could be a problem. But what MMT says is that finance is not the problem. We can always afford to put resources to use. Since employment is very important to the operation of the economy, and it's the means through which most people support themselves, it makes perfect sense that the government step in and play the role of providing a universal job guarantee. Because unlike the government, private for-profit firms are financially constrained. And it's really not in their interest, and it's not really their business to simply provide jobs because people want jobs. They hire only when it's deemed to be profitable. And so there's no reason to expect that the economy would operate at full employment on its own. And if we think that employment is important, it's the government's role to fill that gap and hire those that are left behind by the private sector through the thick and thin of the business cycle. So, I mean, this is the main argument for it.
Thanks. I think our other host wanted to ask a question as well.
Oh, can I just chip in with a commercial break? So, well, Radix, we put on all these events for free. If you want to become a donor to Radix, please contact Ben or look at our website. But I just want to advertise our next webinar, which is on Monday, 25th of January, Culture, the Enemy of Progress, with a new paper by Simon Mundy. And the events in Washington last week really confirmed the title of this. So that should be a really good event. I wanted to also chip in with a question, because it's for both of you, but really for Randy. So I think, everyone who hears this idea of a jobs guarantee thinks, what a great idea, that's fantastic. Although it's sort of been tried quite a lot before, but practically, is that viable? I mean, for example, what sorts of jobs could you give people? And I think you do it, you advocate doing it via the private sector, via the third sector. And this would be a kind of mass of people who could come and go when they wanted, suddenly descending on and what sorts of jobs could they possibly do? And what about health and safety regulations and training and et cetera, et cetera. And let alone the undermining, other people's jobs. So wouldn't it be a sort of race to the bottom of very poor quality jobs with lots of other practical? So in theory, yes, but what in practice, is this a viable suggestion? So you've probably thought about this quite a lot.
Well, look, the program has got to fit the institutional arrangements of the country where it will be implemented. So it's got to be institutionally specific. And we've done a lot of work on formulating a strategy for the United States. The original idea of a job guarantee was modeled on the US experience during the New Deal, so New Deal jobs creation programs. But those were highly centralized. They were formulated and run out of Washington. We think that it probably makes more sense to decentralize in the United States. We're a big country. We have lots of different levels of government and lots of not-for-profit community service organizations. So our idea is to decentralize and let them come forward with proposals that will create jobs that operate in the public interest to serve the local communities. Pavlina Cherneva has recently published a book that goes through this in detail. Care for the community, care for people, and care for the environment. Those would be the kinds of jobs. This deviates significantly from the New Deal projects, which the WPA, the biggest program, mainly was involved in massive infrastructure projects. Those don't really make sense for the kind of program that we need today. Most of the jobs are going to be in the service sector. Most workers today in the United States are in the service sector. If we talked about a job guarantee program in a developing nation, you could imagine that a lot of it probably would be in an infrastructure. So this is why I'm saying that it needs to be institutionally specific. Our jobs are not in the for-profit sector. That's not what we advocate, because there are obvious issues of competition and incentives that would act as a barrier. So we would only include not-for-profits, local levels of government, school districts, park districts, and so on. Possibly workers' co-ops could be an experimental form of job guarantee supported programs. But we're really not talking about using the private for-profit sector to do this. The final question on the quality of the jobs, and are these going to be low-paid, low-benefit jobs? No, we would use the program to raise wages, benefits, and working conditions through the economy as a whole. So we would strive and move toward a living wage. If the program pays a living wage, then all private employers, as well as other public employers, are going to also have to pay a living wage. And we can use this program to increase other kinds of benefits and improve working conditions. Eventually, maybe we can even have paid vacations, which we do not have in the United States. So it would be a way to actually increase the working standards.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Paul to tell us what he thinks about this part of the MMT, or just the project or the idea of a job guarantee in general. And maybe also address the question that appears in, maybe not in the chat, but in the discussions of MMT, whether the idea of job guarantee is influenced quite a lot by the fact that the Fed, as one of the mandates, has full employment, which is not really common among many other central banks, but that partially feeds into the thinking of the MMT. Paul?
Okay, thank you, Magda. Well, this idea of universal job guarantee sounds good, of course. It's like motherhood and apple pie. Who is against? Nobody is against these things. The problem that I see is that, how do you deal with the fact that the political system in many of these situations will try to capture this, right? And it will be used, and it has been in many European countries. We actually have had systems like that are actually captured then by politicians, who will then give the jobs to those that are part of their support. And so you have to be much more specific about how we are going to do that, how we are going to avoid these political failures, right, that are there. I mean, it's not enough to think of a government like a Platonic one that will do the right thing for society, but we have to think about a government that is populated by politicians that will use these programs so as to increase their political power. That's the environment in which we have to think about these things. And then I would rather say, well, let's try to delineate responsibilities, right? Political systems are in general not good at selecting at a micro level the winners and the losers. Either firms but also individual people. We are going to give you a job, right? We are going to support individuals to giving a job. That's not what governments and politicians are good at. They of course, often would like to do that to achieve particular political objectives, but that's not what you wanted to have. What government should do is to do these things that the markets fail to do, right? That's providing public goods, for example. That's why governments have to do public investment, because the markets fails there. Governments have to take care of externalities. These are the things that governments have to do, but not the micromanagement, which typically governments are ill-suited to provide. That's why I think, although I have, in fact, I've been claiming for quite some time that we should do much more public investment. We have seen in many countries, in Europe in particular, the share of public investment declining dramatically in the last decades. And that's where governments should put their emphasis, right? Do the public investment so as to make sure that the infrastructure is there, so as to make sure that the environment is maintained. These are the kind of things that government should focus on, not providing job guarantees, because that doesn't seem to me to be the right thing to do. And if you do the public investment, then jobs will follow. Private investors will also follow public investment. And then I think markets are better suited in making sure that you create jobs that are productive, provided the government also is there to stimulate public investment.
Can I just clarify? We are decentralized. Our proposal is to decentralize the program, to take it out of the hands of politicians.
Local politicians, then.
The federal government would only provide the wages. They can pay directly to Social Security numbers to reduce the chances of fraud. We will have established not-for-profit community service organizations putting forward proposals. They already are serving the local communities. We're just saying that they can add some projects, they can add some employees, and those wages would be paid by the federal government. It's not a micromanagement that is coming out of Washington. I love public infrastructure investment too, but the reality is that you will leave behind the vast majority of people who need jobs if you focus on big public infrastructure investment programs. Most of the people without jobs are not going to be suitable to be operating heavy equipment. You'll be leaving behind women, you'll be leaving behind minorities, you'll be leaving behind high school dropouts and so on. We need to take people as they are, give them jobs that they can be quickly trained to accomplish.
But you cannot avoid that if you say it's going to be decentralized, that local political systems will have to decide about who will get the jobs, right? Or who is going to decide about these things. It will then be local politicians. How do you know that people at local level can do a better job?
We're not getting very good reception from you, I'm afraid. I can't hear you very well. Oh, yeah, that's better. So, could I just intervene at this point? I thought if anyone from the audience wanted to ask a question, would you like to put your hand up and I can bring you in? But I thought I've been looking through the chat and Richard Murphy has been making lots of comments, some of which are questions. And I wondered, Richard, would you like to ask a question directly? Could you unmute yourself, perhaps?
Hello, I'm not really actually asking questions. I'm trying to actually deal with some of the points that have come up, many of which I don't understand, but I think I'm actually really heavily in agreement with Randy, which is not surprising. I'm known to be a supporter of MMT. And my point is that there's a lot of questions here which actually are taken out of context. And I'd reiterate what Randy says in this context, that this is a description of how things are. So, for example, comparing to the interwar years makes no sense because the UK was effectively on a gold standard for a large part of that period, and there wasn't a fiat currency, and therefore you can't make a comparison. And you can't make a comparison with what happened in 1992, because then the UK was pegged against the ERM. And so, of course, there was an opportunity to arbitrage with the central bank because it was trying to defend an exchange rate which was unsustainable, which MMT would not ask for now. So I think that there are key issues here that people must put aside when they look at this and understand that this might not be theory, but sure as heck it's a description of what is happening now, and you can't go back into history and say it always happens that way. I have had frustrations with what Paul has said as well, because I simply don't buy this argument that, and Randy has again made this point about interest rates and that the R versus G ratio is so critical. That may be with regard to private debt, but I believe there's a confusion in here as well, which is coming over, which is that private debt is the same as government debt. It isn't. They behave in quite different ways. We may well have a private debt crisis now. In fact, I'm absolutely certain we have, and that the government should be looking at how to provide equity to relieve debt crises, in particular the small business sector in the UK, which would increase as a consequence the effective rate of debt recognition on the public balance sheet. But that's not the same as worrying about the public debt, which is inherently manageable. So I'm trying to pull those points out in the comments I've been making rather than raise new questions, really. But thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks. Would Randy or Paul like to speak to that?
Yeah, I would like to speak about it. Well, we better learn from history, right? I mean, and also recent history. In the last 50 years, there have been 35 sovereigns in the world, right? Also monetary sovereign that defaulted on their debt, right? This is a fact, right? We cannot just ignore and say, oh, it will not happen any longer. It happens. And why does it happen? Because these constraints continue to be there. The central bank or a government cannot just set the long-term interest rate at whatever level it wants to do it. Because the long-term interest rate, as I said earlier, is determined by inflation expectations, right? And inflation expectation is not under the direct control of the central bank. The central bank must be sure, if it wants to keep inflation expectation at zero, that it does not create too much money. If it does create too much money, it will not be able to keep the interest rate at the level you want it to have. So you cannot avoid the problem that, of course, public debt is different from private debt. There's no doubt about this. But public debt can and has in the past and will continue in the future to impose financial constraints on governments. And to say that we are now free from these financial constraints, I think, in my view, doesn't make sense.
On these sovereign debts, the Bank of England put out a paper that looked at these, and these are very special circumstances. None of these are developed capitalist countries with their own sovereign currencies. They usually occurred during civil wars and other situations like that. But let me just agree with what Richard was saying. I don't believe that you can apply the term Ponzi finance to a sovereign government that issues its own currency. There is a huge difference between private debt and government debt. The sovereign government can always make all payments. That is not true of a Ponzi firm or Ponzi household. They can be cut off. They really do need to borrow to service their debts. Sovereign governments are not really borrowing. The central bank is making payments on the government's debt. Now, can the government spending be too great? Yes, it can. Can it be inefficient? That is, as I was already talking about, spending on interest, which may not be very effective at stimulating the economy. If bonds are held abroad or if they're held by institutions and wealthy individuals with very low propensities to consume, then that government spending is really not doing much to help the economy. So those are issues but they are not Ponzi in Minsky's sense of the term, that they are in danger of defaulting.
Well, they are. I mean, I'm sorry to say, I mean, if the interest rate exceeds the growth rate of the economy and the government finances the interest payment by issuing new debt, that leads to an explosive debt to GDP ratio. That's what I mean with the Ponzi game, right? I mean, it's not in the same sense of Ponzi doing that in the 1920s, but it is the same situation where governments are financing the interest payments by issuing new debt. And when the interest rate exceeds the growth rate of the economy, then you are in an unstable situation that you will have to deal with either by austerity or by inflation.
Japan doesn't have inflation.
But that doesn't mean, I mean, it's not because one country doesn't have inflation that proves your point. I'm sorry to say, right? I mean, I'm just telling you that in the recent past, we have been in a situation where the nominal interest rate was exceeding the nominal growth rate, and countries were forced to do austerity to prevent an explosive situation. Don't tell me that there were no financial constraints, and these were highly developed countries.
Okay, this is fantastic, because normally in Radix events we're accused that everyone agrees with each other, and now we're having this great disagreement. I just figured we all got to finish in a moment. I think we're just bringing one more question, Magda, should we?
Yes. We've just talked about the role of the state and maybe the failures of the state or the benefits of that. Lucy Say had quite some comments on the topic on the chat. Can you ask the question yourself?
I can, thank you. It was actually not related to that, but it was sort of in that area. And I guess the question for me is, I follow MMT a little bit online and post-Keynesian sort of viewpoints as well. And what I'd like to understand is sort of the key areas where MMT diverges from other schools of post-Keynesian economics, because there are sort of some quite prominent post-Keynesians that will get quite heated when you sort of talk about MMT with them. And so I just wondered, Randall, if you could highlight those sort of key bits, if it's possible to do that in a short space of time.
I think I would have to hear what disagreement you're referring to. I think post-Keynesian is a very broad group of people. They're all after Keynes and to some degree followers of Keynes, but many of them disagree with a lot of Keynes. And so I think their disagreements with us are the same disagreements they have with Keynes.
Okay, no, that's useful. As long as I'm not missing something big. It's a good answer.
You know, it's just, sorry, it's just a little too vague. I know that one thing, there are many post-Keynesians who also object to the job guarantee, and they fear that full employment must be inflationary because they have in the back of their mind the old Phillips curve notion that you need a reserve army of the unemployed to hold inflation at bay. And our argument is that a reserve army of the employed is actually more functional than a reserve army of the unemployed for a variety of reasons. A reserve army of the unemployed eventually becomes unemployable. And what we've seen, and I can't speak to data for other countries, but for the United States, a larger and larger share of our measured unemployment is long-term unemployed people. Long-term unemployed people don't serve the reserve army of the unemployed function because they're not plausibly employable from the viewpoint of the employers. So they actually do not hold wages down, okay? And so our argument is keeping people employed so that they have a work history, they have a record that they can present to employers, makes them more functional in the sense that they're available to be hired. And so they can reduce inflation pressures on wages in a way that the long-term unemployed cannot. And the goal is to ensure that everyone in the job guarantee program, I emphasize this is a goal, okay, we're realistic, they will be gaining experience and skills and training on the job so that they become more employable than they were before they came into the job guarantee program. So this is one of the big disputes that a lot of post-Keynesians have with us. They buy the Phillips curve argument and we do not. We argue that there's a better path, and that is to keep people employed, to keep them ready so that when the private sector does start to grow, they can recruit out of the reserve army of the employed, what we call the job guarantee program.
Thank you.
I think that there is something there in countries that are resource constrained or perhaps rely on access to dollars for critical imports and things like that. So, but that is something that you would recognise, that there are balance of payments constraints on countries that are monetarily sovereign.
There are resource constraints. So we all face resource constraints, okay, potentially. Up to some point, we've employed all of our domestic resources. Then we have to rely on resources in the rest of the world so we can import. And the resource constraints on developing countries are more significant than they are for rich countries like the UK or the United States. We are resource rich. And they can run up against those resource constraints much more quickly than we do. So yes, but the job guarantee helps to answer that, because you can use the job guarantee to increase your domestic resource availability. So that's what we argue. It's not a simple solution, but it is part of a solution. Go ahead and get your labor employed to increase your domestic resources as an alternative to having to import everything, which then can cause balance of payments problems, as you were saying.
Thank you, Randy. And thank you, Paul. We don't have, unfortunately, time for more questions, but I'd like to summarize. We have a couple more questions coming on the chat, and I think these could be considered in the future. For example, Alan Davidson, who asked a lot of questions in the chat, talked about how the usefulness of modern monetary theory and a more Keynesian approach in times of recovery, but then dealing with the effects of this policy at the times of stronger growth. I'd like to summarize, because we seem to have a lot of questions and a lot of frustrations and misunderstandings in the discussion. I think what it really does is that we have approached a moment in economic policy that really calls for a rethinking of some of the major policy dogmas and ways of making policy until now, be it fiscal policy, the process of money creation, the role of central banks, the balance between monetary and fiscal dominance. I think these will remain very important questions. And then also, very importantly, the difference between what countries with monetary sovereignty and high credibility can do versus countries with low credibility and resource-constrained countries can do, and how they can control their growth and money creation. Thank you to both for participating, and to many of our participants for asking so many useful questions. Back to Nick now to close the discussion.
Just wanted to thank both the speakers and Magda for doing such a brilliant job, such short notice. And thank you very much.
And that was the first episode in the series of the Civil Disagreement podcast from Radix, the think tank for the Radical Centre. You can find out more at radix.org. This series is distributed by the Real Agenda network of podcasts for progressive change. You can find out more at realagenda.org.